So who is the author of this book? Who is this Mark that we're talking about? Just a little insight about the author of the Gospel of Mark. Of course, named after him. He is sometimes referred to as John Mark, as we see in Acts of Apostles. But then he is the cousin of Barnabas, as Paul will tell us in Colossians. Now, Mark, in his early stage of life in following Christ, something interesting happened in the life of Mark, also known as John Mark. You see, when Paul and Barnabas had their first missionary journey, as they came together and wanted to reach out, take the gospel out. Now they called John Mark to come alongside with them, and John Mark journeyed with them at the beginning of their first missionary journey. So it's interesting that Mark was with Paul and Barnabas at the very first missionary journey that they took together. But as they journeyed together, interestingly, Mark didn't continue with that journey. He left them and returned. And because he left them and returned, Paul and Barnabas continued with that journey. But interestingly, later on, when Paul and Barnabas were going to go to on their second missionary journey, they wanted to visit the churches that they went there and planted. And so in trying to do that, Barnabas wanted to go with Mark, and Paul said, no. We can't go with Mark. He deserted us. Why go with him? And scripture tells us in Acts of Apostles that they had sharp disagreement. There was sharp disagreement over Mark, whether they should go with him or whether they should leave him. So finally, that led to Paul and Barnabas splitting. So the second missionary journey, Paul went his way, Barnabas went his way, but Barnabas went with John Mark. It is this same John Mark that wrote the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. But it's interesting that Mark gradually grew in his walk with God, grew in his ministry, to the point that Paul wanted him to come visit him in 2 Timothy. He requested for Mark because he talks about Mark with high regard because of his usefulness for ministry. In that, I see God's redemptive work. You see, this is someone who at the beginning of the journey, it felt like he deserted them and wouldn't continue with their first missionary journey. He went with Barnabas in the second missionary journey. And here we are. He wrote the Gospel of Mark. And we're studying about him today. That is God's redemptive work. That is God's way of leading us into becoming the people that he wants us to be. Because this same Mark that deserted them led us into this journey of learning and growing in the life of Christ. He was a very good friend with Peter. And it is believed that it was from Peter that he got most of the insight, most of the first-hand information about Christ, even as he wrote the Gospel of Mark. So we're grateful for this opportunity that Mark has given unto us to see, to learn about the life and ministry of Christ.